Chokma, Hashlaka Chokma. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I want to acknowledge that I speak today from the lands of the Tongva and Chumash people in Topanga, California. And on behalf of UCLA as a land-grant institution, we acknowledge our responsibility to live in good relation with and as good guests of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, also known as the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands. So I'll be moderating today's event and thus have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed speakers. I'll introduce them now and all of them now at the same time, and I'm introducing them in the order that they will speak. Dr. Dylan Rodriguez is an abolitionist teacher, scholar, and collaborator. He's a professor at UC Riverside and co-director of the Center for Ideas in Society. He was named an inaugural Freedom Scholar in 2020, and he recently served as president of the American Studies Association. Dr. Shireen Razak is a distinguished professor and the Penny Kenner Endowed Chair in Women's Studies in the Department of Gender Studies, here at UCLA, and is the founder of the Racial Violence Hub, which is hosting this event and the series that it's a part of. Our commentator, Dr. Leslie Thielen Wilson, is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Arts and Science at the Gender Equality and Social Justice at Nipissing University. I might have pronounced that wrong, I apologize. And our second commentator, Dr. Denise Ferreira da Silva, is an academic and practicing artist. Her work addresses the ethico-political challenges of the global present. She is currently director and professor at the Social Justice Institute, CRSJ, at the University of British Columbia. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Dylan Rodriguez.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dylan Rodriguez. I'm talking to you all from occupied Kauai, Tongva land, Southern California. My place of work is down the street from where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of Taisha Miller shortly before I started working here in 1998. Thank you for the introduction, Shannon, and thank you for inviting me to this, Shireen. This is a really dynamic event, and I'm just so happy that I see some of the names in the participant list and in the chat. I'm really honored to be here. So I just want to open with that acknowledgement. Thank you for inviting me. I always appreciate being invited to stuff. So y'all, I'm gonna talk for maybe 25 minutes, no more than 30. I'm going to share a few PowerPoint screens with you just so we can think through some of the terms and concepts and arguments together just a bit, as well as do some of the close textual reading I want to do. So I apologize. I'm going to read from a prepared text here just to make sure that I get my ideas out in a coherent way. I'm looking forward to the discussion with you all, and I thank you, Leslie, in advance for engaging with this. I really appreciate you. First section of the talk is titled "Reformism as Counterinsurgency." Taken in its totality, the archive of counterinsurgency is an extended, insidious mutation of the civilizational American text. And I put American in bracket quotes there. Counterinsurgency attempts to toxify imagination while laying siege to collective practices of radical freedom and autonomy. It is not only formed in the state's repressive military policing and political might, but is also advanced through the narratives, aesthetics, rhetorics, and institutional solicitations of reformism. By the way, the reason I'm obsessed with this, people, is because I think we're going to be in a reformist moment for the foreseeable future. I think that is the moment we're in. I think it's a responsibility to identify the violences and dangers of this particular reformist moment that we are differently and asymmetrically inhabiting. Okay, so the various institutional responses to the global uprising of Black liberation, Black abolitionists, and Black insurrectionist struggle in 2020. The institutional responses to these uprisings openly expropriate the language, thought, and creativity of radical abolitionist, revolutionary, and anti-colonial movements as part of a cultural ensemble of counterinsurgency. The symbolic, aesthetic, pedagogical, and other cultural productions of counterinsurgency attempt to domesticate the lexicons of revolt in what might be conceptualized as a strategic reformist conquest of ideas and imagination, knowledge and language, pedagogy and aesthetic. Published in 2006, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps' Counterinsurgency Field Manual, also known as U.S. Army Field Manual 3-24, articulates multiple pedagogical strategies and tactics as primary methods for subduing and pacifying resistance to U.S. militarism and empire. While much of the text familiarizes readers with on-the-ground military protocols for neutralizing insurgencies against U.S. occupation, and so-called, in quotes, integrating civilian and military activities. That comes out of chapter 2 of this text. It also weaponizes what it names the learning imperative as a primary technology. As a primary technology of occupation. Counterinsurgency directs Army and Marine Corps officers to, and I'm quoting here, to open channels of discussion and debate, to encourage growth of a learning environment in which experience is rapidly shared and lessons adapted for new challenges. The speed with which leaders adapt the organization must outpace insurgents' efforts to identify and exploit weaknesses or develop countermeasures. So there's nothing in this field manual, which, by the way, you can download for free. Clearly, the U.S. Army Marine Corps did not intend for this to be in any way remotely approaching a confidential document. This is, I think, intended to be a fairly public document for public circulation. But there's nothing in the field manual to suggest that its contents are not as applicable to the political geographies of the United States as they are to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mindanao. Addressing the text's interdisciplinary and multiple methodology approach to pacification, Wendy Brown writes in her 2008 review of counterinsurgency that its contents exhibit a, quote, relentless confounding of conventional boundaries among military, political, economic, and anthropological spheres of activity on the one hand, and an upending of conventional military structure and protocol on the other. And y'all, I'm gonna go back and forth between the PowerPoint and my face, so you don't get sick of staring at PowerPoint. So to think about the context of the counterinsurgency field manual, this is something I don't know why it took me so long to find this out, but this thing was downloaded 1.5 million times within a month of its publication in December 2006. I want you to try to get your minds around that. Okay, this is the counterinsurgency field manual of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps. It was downloaded 1.5 million times within the first month it came out, December 2006. So this mind-boggling figure suggests that it has been perused, at least perused, by a broad audience of readers that extends well beyond Army officers, war on terror soldiers, or the professors and students at West Point, which is, of course, the U.S. Army's prestigious military academy. It's a genocide machine, of course. Counterinsurgency, in other words, seems to be a versatile publication with a remarkably wide circulation that belies its origins and intended usage. Perhaps it is worth considering how this military text both reflects and informs a geography of war that encompasses the reformist responses to an early 21st century crisis of police legitimacy. In resonance with Brown's critical review, I would situate Field Manual 324 as part of an extended statecraft of counterinsurgent domestic warfare in continuity with the long legacies of the FBI's counterintelligence program. Counterinsurgency departs from COINTELPRO, however, by adopting a significantly more expansive approach to asymmetrical warfare and domestic pacification, while retaining the broad, urgent objective of slowing and neutralizing militant opposition to and revolt against U.S. police and colonial power. The field manual foregrounds interdisciplinary methods of solicitation, selective empowerment, and reform, people, including piecemeal changes to economic, governmental, and schooling infrastructures. Counterinsurgent reformism in this instance is a primary composite of an ensemble of legitimation, or we could argue relegitimation. Notably, the text introduces a discrete discussion of this matter with the bold-faced heading, legitimacy is the main objective. Pardon me there we go. The broad directive for fulfilling the pacification mandate indicates an aspiration toward a twisted version of Gramscian hegemony. By twist, I also mean it's kind of wrong, okay? But it's nonetheless a kind of aspirational articulation in some strange way. Quote, counterinsurgents achieve pacification by the balanced application of both military and non-military means. End quote. Accounting for the fact that hegemonic consent is, of course, not possible under conditions of conquest, occupation, or displacement, the strategic goal of legitimacy, a term that has to be distinguished from both hegemony and consent, relies on reformism as a technology of policing. I'll just repeat that because that was a mouthful right there. The strategic goal of legitimacy relies on reformism as a technology of policing. To clarify, I'm not merely thinking of reforms to specific state institutions like prisons and police in this instance. I'm also conceptualizing the full cultural, political, aesthetic, and infrastructural apparatus of reformism as a marshaling of carceral and policing power that includes and exceeds these discrete institutions. So alongside the immediately recognizable counterinsurgency protocols of infiltration, assassination, and blunt military and police force, Field Manual 324 outlines a strategy of reformist triage that ostensibly addresses the material conditions underlying occupied and policed people's revolts. Quote, killing insurgents, while necessary, especially with respect to extremists, by itself cannot defeat an insurgency. Gaining and retaining the initiative requires counterinsurgents to address the insurgency's causes through stability operations as well. This initially involves securing and controlling the local populace and providing for essential services. As security improves, military resources contribute to supporting government reforms and reconstruction projects. I just want to pay really close attention to the rhetoric and the narrative of this manual, because it echoes, I think, a contemporary history that I'm going to jump into right now. So the passage I just read, in my analysis of it anyways, almost seamlessly extends a strategic narrative that draws lessons from the US state's protracted multi-front response to Black radical liberation and revolutionary movements during the mid to late 20th century. As Robert Allen details in the classic study, Black Awakening in Capitalist America. By the way, this is a book I think it's increasingly referenced, but I think it's one of the texts that I still think is stubbornly underread and undercirculated, as much as its insight and analysis is so durable. Anyway, Robert Allen details this in his classic study. And what he details is how a coalescence of philanthropic foundation executives, elected politicians, police officials, academics, opportunistic community-based liberal reformers, and other counterinsurgent actors. In other words, I'm implicating us in this. All right, so I'm saying like this implicates for sure professional scholars for the most part, or as a kind of general totality, it implicates us. But his analysis shows how this group, this kind of loose coalescence of counterinsurgent actors, played a central rather than corollary role in institutionalizing the suppression of domestic Black radicals and revolutionaries during the late 60s and early 70s. Well, actually, I shouldn't say early 70s, through the 1970s is what I really should say. Describing an opening scene in this period of in this period of reformist counterinsurgency, Allen analyzes how Ford Foundation President McGeorge Bundy averred his organization's involvement in the orchestration of a national agenda that in contemporary terms might be described as a philanthropic social justice commitment. Speaking at the annual banquet of the National Urban League in 1966, Bundy revealed to the banquet attendees that, and this is a quotation from Robert Allen's book, that the Ford Foundation, the biggest foundation in the country, had decided to help in the task of achieving, quote, full domestic equality for all American Negroes, end quote. This announcement came as no immediate surprise to Bundy's hearers. For some time, the foundation had been involved in efforts to upgrade Black higher education, and it had given money to Urban League projects in the field of housing. What the Urban League delegates and the American public did not know was that the gigantic Ford Foundation, which had already fashioned for itself a vanguard role in the neo-colonial penetration of the Third World, was on the eve of attempting a similar penetration of the Black militant movement, end quote. So here I want to emphasize and re-emphasize that the rise of these domestic philanthropic initiatives cannot be disentangled from the broader strategic and tactical network of state-organized and state-condoned political and cultural repression that targeted organizations, of course, like the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity, Robert and Mabel Williams chapter of the NAACP in North Carolina, the post-1964 iterations of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other Black radical, liberationist, revolutionary, proto-radical groups during this period, both organized and non-formally or informally organized. In fact, I would say that this ensemble of pacification is a relatively durable one that is openly endorsed by the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. I promise I'm going to stop with the PowerPoints in a minute, but I feel like I just need to make sure that you all know I'm not lying when I read you this stuff. This really does come from the manual. Quote, counterinsurgents typically have to adopt different approaches to address each element of the insurgency. For example, auxiliaries might be co-opted by economic or political reforms, while fanatic combatants will most likely have to be killed or captured. If ongoing and emerging movements in this first quarter of the 21st century are refusing, in general, the normalization and long perpetuity of police violence, terror, and gendered anti-Black killings, then the U.S. Army's field manual would properly characterize these emergences as insurgencies and its most militantly committed participants as domestic insurgents. In fact, it's explicitly done this in various ways. This is where I think it is crucial to delineate the distinctions between reform and reformism. For the sake of clarity, I think it's helpful to conceptualize reform as a logic of institutional maneuvering rather than a discrete agenda or outcome. It represents an approach to social change or institutional change that concedes the existence of prevailing social, economic, political, and/or legal systems, including those organized through the power of anti-Black, racial capitalist, colonial apartheid, and other violently oppressive antisocial and social forms. Agitating for reform within such systems entails identification and adjustment of relatively isolated aspects of their operation, often for the announced purpose of increasing, or at least increasing perceptions of, access and equity in their administration and everyday functioning. And yes, we should be thinking about the university as one of these experimental sites all the time. I'm thinking here as well about voting rights reforms, police training and hiring reforms, and criminal justice policy reforms, such as, for example, the emblematic Obama-era reform of sentencing guidelines for crack cocaine possession. In some cases, the purpose of a given reform is to protect systems against collapse, and in others, it is to create immediate methods of survival for people whose lives and well-being are threatened by those systems. All right, so that's reform. Reformism, on the other hand, is best characterized as a militant ideological and political position. I want to just repeat that, okay, because I think this slips by folks a lot. But I do want to assert this over and over again. Reformism is a militant ideological and political position. There's nothing benign about it. There's nothing default about it. It is a form of militancy, reformism is. And it is often sanctioned by a combination of state power and the institutions that constitute gendered racial capitalism, including those encompassed in the formation of the nonprofit industrial complex that Allen's 1969 study so astutely anticipated at the time of its publication. Reformism militantly stakes the claim that the cultural and political ensemble, including the epistemological structure of an existing order, ought to be protected, legitimated, and sustained, rather than transformed, abolished, or creatively disrupted. As a defense of the existing order, the reformist position may passively and or actively criminalize and endanger those people, communities, and movements that seek fundamental, that is radical abolitionist, anti-colonialist, or revolutionary change to an oppressive arrangement. As Erica Edwards has demonstrated, reformism often pivots on gendered racial performances of respectability, Black respectability, particularly in her study, which often in turn induce or converge with cultural logics of commodification and racial fetish, as well as entrepreneurial, that is neoliberal brand building opportunism. Again, academics, many of our colleagues fall into this all the time. Finally, and most importantly, reformism attempts to delimit the imaginative horizons of political possibility to that which is seen as achievable within the protocols and power relations of existing institutional forms. So under the conditions of anti-Black policing and asymmetrical domestic war, reform at best functions as a method of asymmetrical casualty management. That is, a management of the casualties induced by the genocidal logics of sociality, statecraft, and civilization. And reformism, on the other hand, is a primary political and cultural strategy of counterinsurgency against those undertaking Black radical abolitionist, revolutionary, and liberationist projects of community, collective power, and futurity. So in the next part of my comments, the second half of my comments, I'll review the critical reframing of genocide discourse that I try to build in the fourth chapter of my recent book, White Reconstruction. I apologize in advance to anyone who's already read it. Just bear with me. So on genocide, the modern concept of genocide cannot account for the modern totality of gendered anti-Blackness and racial colonial violence, reframed in the context of the global genealogies of anti-Blackness and racial colonial dominance. The discursive and juridical regimes of genocide invoke but cannot fully engage a deep tracing of the violence encompassed by the long preceding processes of the global civilizational project as such. Genocide, as a conceptual and jurisprudential formulation, is the impasse of the racial. To invoke its terms already suggests exceptionality and absolute abnormality, yet the making of racial power in all its iterations rests on logics of the genocidal that collapse into regimes of normalcy and normativity, universality and humanism, and sociality and civil society. In other words, it's entirely part of the framework. It's entirely hardwired into this half millennial ongoing atrocity. Racialization, what academics and many of my colleagues call racialization, that is the characterization and discursive marking of human bodies and groups within hierarchical valuations of life and being. Sorry, I sped through that. I figure we all know what racialization is at this point. Racialization structures and permeates virtually every form of social differentiation, external identification, military and police mobilization, jurisprudence, national development, and environmental intervention, from the destructive to the allegedly protective, in modern globality, as well as its precedents in the conquest period. The logics of genocide, shaped in the material historical domains of global racialization, thus paradoxically precede the inauguration of genocide, and I put genocide in quotes here, genocide as a formal lexicon. In this sense, anti-Blackness and racial colonial power are the unspoken, illegible preconditions for the term's articulation as a meaningful reference to the intra-racial nadir of white modernity, meaning the Nazi-induced Holocaust in Germany. Following Joy James' prima facie evidence of racism's, what she calls racism's logical culmination in genocide, a classic phrase that I carry with me all the time, but you all know that. This surfaces throughout the long, multiple, and often overlapping genealogies of so-called racism and racial colonial dominance in what Sylvia Wynter names the millennium of man. Y'all that are familiar with Sylvia Wynter's work know that she capitalizes man as part of a naming of the civilizational project of Western humanism, kind of colonial Western humanism. The logic of genocide surfaces in the dispersal of human beings across what Wynter identifies as modernity's fatal racial continuum, characterized by the devastating binary distinction between the selected and the disselected. Some of y'all are very familiar with this quotation, so just let me read it for you one more time. This is Sylvia Wynter. By placing human origins totally in evolution and natural selection, the bourgeois white thinkers of the modern West map the structuring principle of their now bourgeois social structure, that of the selected versus disselected, the evolved versus non-evolved, on the only still extra-humanly determined order of difference, which was left available in the wake of the rise of the physical and, after Darwin, of the biological sciences. This is the difference that was provided by the human hereditary variations, which we classify as races. This is where Du Bois's color line comes in. Y'all might need to screenshot that and meditate on it. I'm going to drop the slide now. I'm going to go away from the slide, but I know that that's a dense quotation. Wynter oftentimes gives us her brilliance with density. So I just want to appreciate that and let y'all screenshot that if you need it. All right. Wynter's and Du Bois's conception of racial modernity focuses on the emergence of the overlapping Western scientific and humanistic epistemes as knowledge forms that symbiotically intertwine the rationalist production of racial difference with the discursive ideological and thus broadly cultural installation of global white ascendancy. The modern, that is the post-World War II, particularly institutionalization of genocide, its formalization as a term, is stalked and disrupted by the world-making, civilization-building, socially productive technologies of dominance that have made possible the consolidation of the very units of sociality, that is, the units of humanity, the civilized world, mankind, the nation state, and even modern jurisprudence, right? So that is what genocide has made possible. Those are the very units of sociality on which the UN Convention on Genocide and hegemonic genocide discourses generally depend for their epistemic and juridical coherence. Omar Bartov convincingly argues in the book Murder in Our Midst that genocide is a logical derivative and synthetic expression of Western modernity rather than a corruption of or aberration from it. His work in this vein is, of course, really analytically useful. It's been really empowering and emboldening for a lot of thinking, including my own. Its insight is in many ways indispensable, especially because his text provides a historicized analysis that so carefully delineates how the modernist logics of rationality, productivity, social development, etc., were central to the architectures and methods of the Nazi-administered genocide in Germany. Crucially, Bartov installs the notion of quote unquote industrial killing as a technology of modernity that blurs distinctions between war, sociality, human labor, and human death. Yet, and this is my departure from Bartov, his theoretical approach does not suffice in addressing the peculiar modern logics of anti-Black genocide or racial colonial genocide as kind of overlapping and divergent forms of violence and power. Anti-Blackness and colonial power, including their genocidal and proto-genocidal forms, are as much defined by irrational, gratuitous, non or dysfunctional, anti-modern and or pre-modern expressions of violence as they are by the clinical, precise, systemic emergence of what Bartov calls industrial killing. So I really want to center that. And this is to echo and advance the way Cedric Robinson understands the foundations of racial capitalism as well, right? It's about war. The constitutive violence of these formations of power consistently befuddle the logics of rationality and industry and cross into the realms of perpetual ontological and cultural degradation, laboriously induced and long-sustained racial terror, multi-generational regimes of physiological disarticulation, including gratuitous violence against the body, mind, and spirit, and so forth. Not only are such anti-modern and pre-modern, one is tempted to say savagely European dimensions of anti-Blackness and racial colonial genocide not addressed by the rubrics of industrial killing and modernist rationality, many of them are not actually about killing at all. Rather, they're about the production of conditions of terror and death that intend to shape targeted people's everyday lives. The historical forms of Aboriginal and Indigenous genocide, by way of paradigmatic example, are replete with supra-rational and extra-rational exercises in systemic degradation, dehumanization, and collective deracination. I understand the limitations of all those terms, by the way, right? I know that it's a lot is about inhabiting a position that's somehow beyond or outside or beneath human. So just flow with me, right? Just take the spirit of what I'm trying to say here. And by deracination, I mean in the dual sense of the forcible separation from one's roots in a certain cultural geography, as well as subjection to gendered and sexual colonial violence that tries to foster one's alienation from their own historical, indigenous, and tribal identity. These genocidal forms mutually shape and do not merely supplement the clinical, brutal, genocidal violence that derives from the systems and logics of modernist rationality, such as that reflected in Bartov's idea of industrial killing. Anti-Blackness and racial colonial power as the global expressions of what Cedric Robinson identifies as civilizational intra-European racialism are the conditions of modernity's material and epistemic coherence as such. The overlapping, contradictory, divergent, asymmetrical, and complexly simultaneous violences of anti-Blackness and racial colonial violence are the animating fields of power that enable the emergence and sustenance of modern institutionalities. What then is the productive violence of such power once such violences are understood as the precursor, production, and perpetual condition of modernity? Building on the analytical, theoretical, and poetic openings created by collectives and organizations like the mid-2010s Chicago-based group We Charge Genocide, the national group All of Us or None, and incarcerated prison strikers from the Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit and Georgia State prisons. There's all stuff that's been unfolding throughout the first quarter of the 21st century. I want to offer a counter thesis that departs from Patrick Wolf's well-known idea of a logic of elimination. The abolitionist, anti-colonial, Black radical, and especially Black feminist, queer, and trans abolitionist radical, and other insurgent inhabitations of geographies of genocidal violence reconceptualize and effectively redefine genocide as a civilizational logic of evisceration that is complex, dynamic, and asymmetrical. It's a mess, in other words, right? And that's part of what poetry does for us, right? It pushes us into that mess. And here I want to offer just two of the potential implications of a redefinition through the poetics of a redefinition of genocide for critical praxis. And I've worked through multiple claims in the full chapter of the book. So the first one I want to think about is a deeper focus on the gendered technologies of evisceration. How those gendered technologies of evisceration challenge some of the hegemonic gender narratives that surround genocide and genocidal violence. A scholar named Adam Jones, for example, claims in his very widely referenced article titled Gendercide and Genocide. It's an almost canonical kind of piece in the relatively recent field of what's called genocide studies. But what he claims is that the targeted killing of men composes the primary gendering force in the history of mass murder, war, and genocide. Referencing several examples from the 1980s and the 1990s, Jones contends, and I'm quoting him here, regardless and crucially, the most vulnerable and consistently targeted population group through time and around the world today is non-combatant men of a battle age, roughly 15 to 55 years old, end quote. Right? That's the inventory that kind of becomes the common sense in genocide discourse, including and especially academic discourse. However, Jones's claim becomes far less credible when accounting for the long genealogies of eviscerating and arguably genocidal anti-Black and racial colonial violence. Within the living archives of evisceration, the categories and abstracted classifications of gender and sexuality are destabilized and disrupted, subjected to various forms of distortion, transgression, and manipulation and mutilation within the infrastructure and the emergence of the world to which Jones refers. Cultural and juridical attacks on the biologically and discursively essentialized biological female womb, colonialist and chattel constructions of birth status inheritance, free and unfree, citizen and non-citizen, and discursive constructions of cisgender women and non-binary genderqueer people as objects of specific forms of genocidal violence reflect the logic of evisceration as an actively gendering form of power. Such violence does not merely come to bear on already existing statically gendered bodies, but is itself engaged in processes of forcefully redefining and remaking gender and gendered sexuality as primary expressions of world-deforming power. Radical feminist and queer conceptions of bodily and sexual violence, for example, challenge the notion that sexual violence is merely a corollary or preparatory element of anti-Black racializing and colonial regimes. Rather, as forms of collective evisceration, such gendered sexual violences are ends within themselves, enacting anti-Blackness, enacting racial colonial dominance as conditions of both intimate and systemic bodily subjection. That's the first point I wanted to reflect on. Second point, a rigorous engagement with the logic of evisceration can embolden a speculative narrative praxis, what I conceptualize in the longer chapter as a poetics of genocide, that positions racial terror, anti-Black terror, collective experiences of physiological vulnerability, and the gendered disruption of people's life worlds as the normalized condition, the normal world of civilization and modernity. While the hegemonic legal and academic genocide regimes betray an overwhelming tendency to privilege notions of the scandalous and the exceptional, a narrative centering of the experiences of evisceration induced by gendered anti-Blackness and racial colonial power decenter the historical and political canonization of the Nazi-administered Holocaust and undermines that Holocaust status as the assumptive, unchallenged, paradigmatic calibration of the outer extremes of modern state power. This narrative and theoretical maneuver directly challenges the installation of a reified category and figure of vulnerable white being as the primary reference point for genocides and modern powers' most egregious casualties. And here I'm thinking about things like Primo Levi's autobiographical and Agamben's ethnographic and historical conceptualization of the Musulman. In conclusion, by way of conclusion, I want to revisit the twisted and violating insult that animates the persistence of reformist ensembles in these contexts, in such contexts of permanent emergency. Reformism suggests that the densely historical, asymmetrical misery and casualties produced by the logic of genocide are fixable flaws in regimes of governance that can be magically disabused of their inequities, disparities, biases, corruptions, and for that matter, genocidal tendencies. Reformism is thus what I would call a civilizational fantasy. It is a civilizational fantasy in which justice, freedom, and equality are achievable within an existing genocidal totality that constantly attempts to rescue the normality of state terror by relegitimating it. Reformism is counterinsurgency of the kind that reproduces as it purports to challenge the casualties of terror and evisceration. In some ways, this is a problem of mistaken or misplaced horizons. Horizons are an expression of interpretation and imagination. They are projected as a matter of necessity. Horizons are political art and cultural praxis. They are collective abstractions of space that often take place as insurrection against regimes of spatial endangerment. In this sense, I want to say there's plenty of room to engage in meaningful and creative collective praxis under genocidal and proto-genocidal duress. But doing so requires that the problem of political horizon be posed in the first place as a problem. By this, I mean that political horizon can be rethought and reimagined in a way that renders reformist solutions obsolete, and in fact reframes reformism as a primary accomplice to the terror that is behind and around, infiltrating thought and imaginary. As a pedagogical tool, I often rely on the concept of domestic warfare to re-narrate the normalized conditions of the United States against liberal frameworks of reformable inequality, fixable disparity, and solvable systemic dysfunction. The bare persistent facts of asymmetrical casualties regularly suffered and involuntary inherited across multiple generations of targeted peoples do not speak for themselves. Rather, these facts must be placed in the service of storytelling that undermines and destroys the sturdy, pseudo-religious, common sense assumptions that vindicate existing cultural, economic, and state institutions as capable and or worthy of reform and preservation. This is to focus on unshared, targeted terror. I'm taking a shot here at the kind of constant refrains and notions of the universal when folks talk about terror. So I want to emphasize the unshared, targeted terror, a living archive of collective encounter that separates embodied categories of endangered existence into singular collective positions of shared breath, mutual survival, and insurgent community amidst living nightmares of anti-sociality and state violence. The work of the reformist counterinsurgency is to disarticulate, reassemble, and re-narrate these singular facts into texts of patriotic reform, gendered racial teleology, and liberal vindication. Therefore, the labor of abolitionists, Black liberationists, anti-colonialists, and all beautiful insurgents is to turn the terror on itself, to wage unrelenting creative violence against it for the sake of destruction, to be sure, but also as a preliminary condition for honoring what my recent friend, Amika Tendahi, co-founder of Ujima Medics, calls the deep responsibility of care, grace, and militantly defended life against the atrocity of the normal. Thank you all for paying such good attention, and I'm done.
Thank you so much, Dylan, for that powerful, powerful talk. And I think you'll be in interesting dialogue with our next speaker, so I'll turn it over to Shireen Razak.
I'm really glad to be here to speak with Dylan on this panel, because I think our work does complement. In fact, he set me up rather well for my talk. I'm really happy also to have Leslie Thielen Wilson and Denise Da Silva here, because these are the responses that I would really like to have today. So I entitled this talk Gray Zones in Law, Sexual Terror, Genocide, and the Erotic Schemes of Settler Colonialism. So let me begin, as I have on other occasions, apologies to people who've heard it too many times, but let me begin with the words of the Justices Alvin Hamilton and Murray Sinclair, who were commissioners of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba, Canada, in 1991, which is a long time ago, and coincidentally around the time that I first began to think about settler colonialism. Concluding their analysis of the murder of 16-year-old Helen Betty Osborne, an Indigenous schoolgirl in the town of Depah, Manitoba, by 4 white men who took her to an isolated area and sexually brutalized her, the commissioners concluded with these words: "There is one fundamental fact. Her murder was a racist and sexist act. Betty Osborne would be alive today had she not been an Aboriginal woman." The statement is remarkable and singular. I've not been able to find anything like it elsewhere in law. What I've been trying to think about for the past few decades is this fundamental fact. Betty Osborne would not have been killed, and they might have added would not have been killed in that particular way had she not been an Aboriginal woman. It's just as a side note, Helen Betty Osborne was remembered rather disingenuously, I think, recently upon the 50th anniversary of her death, when Canadian media began claiming that her death inaugurated a recognition of racism in the justice system. Sexual violence as a genocidal tactic directed at Indigenous populations has actually been named as such in the Canadian inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. The sexualized killing of Indigenous women is so widespread that it merits its own abbreviation, MMIW, which it has had for more than a decade. 2 decades have now passed since the justices declared so unambiguously that what happened to Betty Osborne was entirely due to the fact that she was an Indigenous woman. They spelled out what they meant by declaring that Indigenous women in the town were seen as objects with no human value and as bodies available for sexual violation and annihilation. Further, it was clear to the commissioners that white men who kill Indigenous women were well protected by the settler collective, the white settler collective, which are words I first took from Leslie Thielen Wilson. The town of DePauw, Manitoba kept the secret of Betty Osborne's murder for 25 years until the commissioners came to town. So my own attempt to think through settler colonialism and the sexualized violence on which it depends was first shaped by these facts. In fact, the words of the commissioners, the words they used to describe the tremendous violence that had been unleashed on Helen Betty Osborne, they described it as the killers exhibiting an unimaginable fury. And that's the title of the book I'm currently working on, because it is the unimaginable fury of white men, a genocidal fury directed at Indigenous women that I want to understand in the framework of genocide. So if police violence is one place where we see state violence against Indigenous men, sexual violence by settlers and police alike is a parallel site for Indigenous women. We might even consider, Dylan mentioned, the mass killing of men, but we might consider where the mass killing of Indigenous women happens. From Betty Osborne to Pamela George, who was murdered by two white college students who contracted with her for sex and then took her outside the city and murdered her, to Cindy Gladue, who is the focus of this paper, the Indigenous woman's body is the surface on which the white settler state is made. When in 2011, Cindy Gladue, a Cree woman, was found dead in a hotel bathtub in the room of a white man named Bradley Barton, a trucker who had contracted with her for sex, I found myself once again considering the genocidal impact of the sexual annihilation of Indigenous women in the context of prostitution. Today, I'm revisiting what I first wrote about this case, and there's a reference to that article on the Racial Violence Hub site if you want to check it. So I'm revisiting what I first wrote when Barton was actually acquitted in 2015 of the murder. On appeal in 2021, Barton was convicted of manslaughter. So I'd like to consider today what Dylan Rodriguez has been talking about when he talks about the genocidal logic of reformism. The moves that the settler state makes to protect, again, what he calls the epistemological center of settler colonialism. I specifically want to attend to the genocidal logic behind the liberal approach taken by the appeal court in this case. The outcome of the second trial appears to offer some measure of justice. At least Barton was convicted of manslaughter this time, we all say. And it is certain that Cindy Gladue's family derives some measure of relief from this outcome. Today, I would like to suggest that the outcome paradoxically relies on denying the very reason why Gladue died, the colonial sexual terror directed at her person, and that remains a principal way in which Indigenous women are targeted. In other words, the genocidal machinery remains very much in place and in fact is kept in place by the liberal logic, a logic that troublingly feminists can reproduce and may even have inspired when they seek to replace terms like prostitute with that of sex worker in a bid to counteract the stigma that the former carries. So let me just introduce the case in brief, and I must immediately warn that there is no easy way to avoid racial and sexual spectacle and the infliction of trauma on others when discussing the case and the pain that it brings to Cindy Gladue's family and to so many others. So in 2011, 36-year-old Cindy Gladue bled to death, as I said, in a hotel bathroom. The defense maintained that she bled to death from a tear that occurred during an episode of consensual rough sex when Barton inserted his fists into her vagina. The Crown, that is to say, it's the Canadian context, so the Crown or the prosecution argued that the 11-centimeter wound had actually been caused by a knife. And if a knife theory were to be proven, Barton would be found guilty of murder. In a bid to demonstrate its theory about the knife, and on the advice of the senior pathologist in the case, the Crown introduced as evidence Cindy Gladieu's vagina, tissue apparently severed from the rest of her body. The judge permitted the severed part of the pelvic area to be viewed on a screen behind which the pathologist testified, as he pointed to the actual tissue. So I've written about all that, and you should note that the introduction of a body part into the courtroom prompted many to think about the desecration of remains and to bring the colonial past into the present. People started mentioning Sarah Baartman, for example. So in my analysis of the first trial, when Barton was exonerated, I proposed that we must understand this violence as colonial terror and see the introduction of her vagina in the courtroom as a memorialization of terroristic death. I also argued that the goal of the excessive sexualized violence that Barton meted out to Gladieu was in order to destroy the figural unity of the body of the Indigenous woman and to transform it into waste. I suggested that the scopic regime of sexualized violence is key to disposability. The violence that is written on the flesh tells the colonial story of whose bodies have value. The law participates in gender disposability through the creation of legal gray zones where such sexualized violence is permitted. Importantly, the first trial of Bradley Barton effaced the ongoing colonial story, and it did so largely through a focus on prostitution. The prostitute's body occupies a special place in the law, a legal gray zone, in Ranjana Khanna's words, that has everything to do with the place where life is transformed into matter, as Françoise Vergès put it. Gladieu was injured to the point that her vaginal wall ruptured, causing her death. But in adjudicating this violence in the context of a paid-for sexual service, the law authorizes the existence of a class of women targeted for disposability. I'd like to add to these arguments. In 2017, the Alberta Court of Appeal overturned the acquittal of Barton for murder and ordered a new trial. The Supreme Court also weighed in after Barton filed his own appeal. The Supreme Court decided there should be a new trial, but only on a charge of manslaughter. The matter of a possible knife was to be left behind. The court's reasoning for granting the appeal may have struck some feminists as everything they could have wished for. First, the Court of Appeal objected to the language used by all parties during the first trial, noting that references to Gladieu as a prostitute, native girl, or native woman encouraged, and I quote, discriminatory beliefs or biases about the sexual availability of Indigenous women, and especially those who engage in sexual activity for payment. The Supreme Court added that when jurors heard that Gladieu had 2 encounters with Barton, it prejudiced them about her sexual activities, stigmatizing her for sex work. In a kind of pious tone, the court opined, and I quote, the criminal justice system did not deliver on its promise to afford dignity. Her life mattered, she was valued, she was important, she was loved. Her status as an Indigenous woman who performed sex work did not change any of that in the slightest. Taking this injunction seriously, the appeal court dismissed a juror who was alleged to have commented that, and I quote again, prostitution was bad from the get-go. None of this would have happened if that hadn't been part of it. In what reporters described as the winding road of legal decisions, we see these pathways moving through the abstractions that populate the liberal landscape. Worker, woman. Gladieu can travel the road to justice only if she sheds her particularity, that is, her colonial history. Through the abstractions, she becomes a victim to whom something bad happened at work. Simultaneously, and here's the rub, Barton shed his own colonial history and what Greg Thomas calls the sexual demons of colonial power. This insistent purging of prostitution and coloniality and their interconnections from the story were apparently meant to offer Gladue a dignity that was absent from the first trial. So my question, how far have we come from one trial to the next in naming and confronting genocidal and unimaginable fury? So my rethinking begins with a reminder of what Denise da Silva has called the space of raciality. This is why I wanted to invite her to comment. I often draw on Denise for this kind of thinking. Writing of police killings of the residents of Rio's Black favelas, Denise Ferrara da Silva reminds us that raciality lies at the basis of the state's decision to kill certain persons or to approve of their killings. Bodies and territories come to acquire the status of those not included in the ranks of the human, nobodies in Silva's terminology, who always already signify violence and against whom violence is authorized. Such persons and territories occupy a negative relationship to law. Their annihilation secures the security of the state. Raciality collapses justice into violence. Further, and I'm quoting Denise again, even in works that refuse the liberal version of racial domination, that is to say, the logic of inclusion, and that describes the scene of violence, the Black body is given to representation. It is always already the body of violence, the body of the slave, the body of the maid, the body of the lynched Black child, female or male. It is always already the Black and violated/violent person, victim of the always already valued, protected white other. That is, a body that can only signify the juridico-economic architectures of slavery, patriarchy, and capitalism. I've always wished that Denise had included in this list the body of the prostitute, and she could perhaps tell me later if she has done so elsewhere. Da Silva's argument that violence enters into the very constitution of political categories themselves, as she put it, in Blackness, in whiteness, the maid and the housewife, as in the native and the settler, these prompt her to ask what would happen if one stayed with the violence. That is, if we did not allow it, as I understand it, to stay hidden behind the categories. What account of racial subjugation and Black response would emerge from this? We would not get very far, she writes, if we explode the categories, only to reinstall the male body in the account of desire it signifies, the native as man, the nation as autonomous collective. What if we stayed with the body as excess, as, and I quote, a figuring of an unrepresentable, unregulated desire, the body that remains outside the legal moral order and outside economic and symbolic production, the thing, she calls it. What response would emerge if we were to refuse to imagine Cindy Gladue as an abstract woman who had a problematic John? What if we stayed with her body as excess, remembering the surface on which colonial power is imprinted? There is violence embedded in the concept of sexuality itself, as several scholars have pointed out. Building on Horton Spiller's idea of the pornotrope, for example, a process of objectification directed at Black and Indigenous peoples and that violently reduces people into commodities while simultaneously rendering them sexually available. Wahela reminds us that the processes of the pornotrope, projection and objectification, and the processes of sexuality, possession and desire, reveal the violence embedded in the concept of sexuality itself. Amber Musa asserts Black women and Indigenous women are positioned as highly charged affective objects. The fleshiness that the pornotrope manufactures is mobilized, she says, through histories of addiction, sex work, and woundedness, markings of the Black body in pain. So how to keep the pornotrope in mind when considering the violence directed at Indigenous women, whether in the context of prostitution or not, is something that I attempt to do. I want to keep an eye on how analytical frames such as sex work functions to obscure the pornotrope, installing in its stead a universal woman, an agentic subject, as well as a universal man whose sex drive leads him mysteriously to pay an indigenous woman for sex. So where we begin with what Greg Thomas calls the colossal sexual significance of colonialism. In his book, The Sexual Demon of Colonial Power, Pan-African Embodiment in Erotic Schemes of Empire, Thomas reflects on what he terms the erotic brutality of race, where the rule of Europe assumes a notably erotic form and where Black people are conceptualized as an undisciplined mass of sexual savages. He invokes Sylvia Wynter, who remarked that the man of reason masters the world of sensuality, leaving everyone else to the realm of primitive sex. So Thomas begins his argument with the colossal sexual significance of colonialism, and I aspire to do the same, keeping in mind his reminder concerning the coding of sexuality for empire. As he puts it, and I'm quoting, "The white world is always renaturalized as a universal standard of human civilization and its erotic practice, and the mechanics of race that inscribe it are erased from the category of sexuality itself. No one else exists, nor does the sexual violence waged against us by them." Such a twofold erasure cannot be underestimated, for sexuality is academically coded to mean what colonizers do to themselves for pleasure, not what they do to the colonized for purposes of pain, pleasure, or politics. When I track the coding of sexuality in the second trial, it is clear that the sexual violence waged against us by them is entirely erased by the focus on what colonizers do to themselves for pleasure. For Barton, his sexuality is seen to require inserting his fists as violently as possible into Cindy Gladieu's vagina, a topic he researched tirelessly on pornography sites, asking search engines to direct him to ripped cunts. Although this latter detail, ruled inadmissible during the first trial and permitted in the second, brought some of the violence into the courtroom and surrounded Barton with what his lawyer called a stink, the spectacle happily coexisted with the naturalization of the kind of sex Barton pursued and of his right to pursue it, installing him simultaneously as both colonizer, able to go anywhere and do anything, and as sexually pathological. We should always remember, as I argued in the earlier article, that the horror invoked by the phrase and the site ripped cunt is not the same as terror, although it has a terrorizing effect. As Cavarero explains, the savaging of body as body is the scopic regime that declares a body and a class of bodies as disposable. Horror is then the handmaiden to colonial terror. Horror does not supplant terror, but instead provides a script for it. I have been wondering if horror is itself a quintessential liberal affect, enabling us to separate everyday colonizers from pathological ones and to experience ourselves as good people who are horrified. It will come as no surprise that the liberal mechanism that would abstract Gladieu and Barton from their histories, situating them instead on a liberal landscape, would leave us with nothing but flesh, the surface on which colonial power would be inscribed, but which would be described neutrally and scientifically in the courtroom as vaginal tissue. The vagina maintained the same starring role that had so disturbed us during the first trial, only this time it appeared not as itself, but as the diagrams that enabled the court, with the help of expert witnesses, to debate its elasticity, its capacity, that is, to absorb the forceful thrusting of a man whose large fists would be traced on a piece of paper so that the court could gauge their capacity to rip. The court spent many hours discussing whether pain receptors in the lower vagina are different from the upper portion of the vagina. much of the discussion revolved around the kind of pain that fisting likely delivered and the kind of pain that a vagina can withstand. The predictable argument of the defense, one that I earlier identified in all inquests and inquiries into Indigenous and Black deaths in custody, was that Gladue possessed a damaged vagina and thus brought death upon herself. The questions posed by the defense to its own gynecological expert captures the installation of the Indigenous body as a sick and thus already always dying body. As the defense counsel put it to his expert, what we do know is that she was 36 years old, had 3 births, and the last one had been over 9 years prior. And we know that she had no upper teeth and her lower teeth were in poor repair. Did you know that? Yes, answered the expert. I read that in the autopsy report. He then added that her nutritional status was thin. She smoked. The expert, a doctor from California, proposed that the 11-centimeter tear was actually caused by a fingernail. As he put it to the court, his name is Paul Sinkhorn, Gladue's vagina was a damaged one. Some women have very, very poor tissue, he opined. Although he had no access to Gladue herself, he felt confident that her slight frame was evidence of malnutrition. Her missing teeth, her vaginal infection, which was not proved at all of this was put for the court's consideration. While all of these tactics may be understood to be standard ones in a criminal trial, we should remember the emotional and racial work that they do, even when these arguments are easily rebutted. It would have been hard to dislodge the sexually degenerate Indian body, and perhaps it is even hard for you now to do so as I recount these details. If I show you a picture of a very beautiful Cindy Gladue, would that help? What happened to the account of Barton's unimaginable fury and to what Fanon labeled white phallic hallucinations of rape and prostitution run wild? If Cindy Gladue remained in the vestibule, to use Spiller's vocabulary, forever outside of modernity and only as thing, Barton himself was constituted as the colonizer who could go anywhere and do almost anything. The almost is the liberal gesture, only serving to emphasize his sovereignty rather than to undermine it. A married white trucker and father of 26-year-old twin boys, who called his common law wife every night, Barton gave an account of himself that attempted to transform the activities of the night into something banal and everyday, the transformation of sexual violence into after-work relaxation. His defense frames his actions as what one does after a hard day's labor, and we hear a great deal about this labor. Drink with friends, look for companionship, which he secures by asking a man scrounging for cigarette butts by the bar if he knew of any lady friends. The man turns out to be Cindy Gladue's pimp, who's only ever called her boyfriend in the court. Negotiating to pay Gladue $60 instead of $100 that she asked for, Barton listed for the court what he expected the $60 to buy. Foreplay. She would give me head. I would fondle her, play with her boobs, put my hand down by her vagina, put my fingers in it, and have intercourse, no condoms. This is straightforward sex work, the official logic goes. There's nothing in this arrangement that we might question or contextualize outside of the idea of contract between a buyer and a seller, albeit a contract gone wrong. When the prosecution suggests that Barton thought he could do to Gladue whatever he pleased and that he treated her like property for a sum of money, his response that Gladue was a working girl keeps the discussion on the matter of consent and thus on sex for pay. All went well the first night. Gladue rejoined her boyfriend in quotation marks after an hour, providing her phone number to Barton. And the next night follows the same script, except that it now included a friend of Barton, another white man, who is asked by Barton if he wanted a piece of Gladue. When the boyfriend looked concerned that there were now 2 men instead of 1, Barton gives him $5 to go away. The friend declines the offer anyway. What, if anything, is reprehensible about this encounter? Would it be in the small amounts of money, the trading of Gladieu's body, at times without her consent, as the prosecution argued, the brutalizing and the death that followed? Where might we find missing and murdered Indigenous women in similar circumstances, or Indigenous women who met the fate that Helen Betty Osborne did? Is there a line between one woman's fate and the other? Consent is, of course, the standard way in which we differentiate between Helen Betty Osborne and Cindy Gladieux. The women may share a fate, but only Gladieux can be imagined as having brought her death upon herself by having consented. In the best scenario proposed by the prosecution, Gladieux simply encountered a callous man, a bad John, who did not care to respect the limits of the contract and who let her bleed to death. While the commissioners of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry that I began with took note of the coloniality of the encounter, no such care was applied to Gladieux. Neither an interrogation of the meaning of white sex in the prostitution contract, nor one about the value of her life to others were part of this generic conversation about fisting and what could go wrong when large hands are inserted into damaged vaginas. The liberal promise of inclusion is only made good if we can see Cindy Gladieux as the victim of an unusually callous man, a man who practices bad sex. And it is this logic that you find in the decision that convicts him of manslaughter. There can be no discussion of genocidal force and unimaginable fury in that room. So let me just conclude. Genocide, Mahmoud Mamdani wrote in the context of the Rwandan genocide, must always be thinkable. Journalists writing of this genocide frequently used words like unimaginable, unthinkable, irrational, but genocide has a history and a logic, and so too unimaginable white men's fury has a history and a logic. We cannot answer the question of how much force is too much force without attention to the erotic schemes of settler colonialism. For me, the main task in understanding sexualized violence has always been to follow these erotic schemes of empire, tracking the work that they do in the maintenance of colonial racial regimes. I see this as parallel to and intersecting with the thrust of Black feminist work on always keeping in mind the Black body is flesh. One persistent response that I've had to my attempts over the years to theorize what happened to Gladieux and others as genocidal racial violence is the view that I have flattened out and homogenized what the prostitution contract is, and in the process, I've eclipsed Gladieu's agency. I've been at a loss to respond to this critique, and I often descend, as perhaps I have today, into something that feels a little too self-righteous, too committed to binaries and resistant to alternate conceptions of sex and sexuality, and indeed of work. But how do we track the erotic brutality of race that is repressed in the very language of sex? Put in Fanonian terms, the question is, what keeps out of bounds colonial sexuality, a sexuality organized around colonial racism? What would happen if we stayed with the violence? One of my goals in presenting this admittedly rudimentary analysis today has been to get some help with this question. Dylan often notes in his work that the phrase police brutality should be replaced by genocide, and that we should insist on genocide's everydayness and not its exceptionality. I'm offering that the sexual violence directed at Indigenous women must be considered a genocidal violence, and for that characterization to carry the day, we'll have to dispense with ideas of sex work and perhaps even of prostitution. Dare we think abolition? What would it take to abolish prostitution?
Thanks so much, Shireen, for another powerful talk. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the views of our commentators today. So let's move on to comments from Leslie Thielen-Wilson.
Thank you, Shannon. And thank you, Shireen and Dylan, for your incredible scholarship and for your provocative papers today. And my task is to focus on Dylan's work. And I'll be basically saying nothing substantive and just pointing to three key ideas from his chapter 4 in his book, White Reconstruction. And then at the end, I'll raise two questions, both of which I believe have been answered already. But I'll raise them again. Hopefully they will spark conversation. So I'm first, again, going to just highlight three ideas of Dylan's. And the first idea is that of white reconstruction as an inherently violent response to Black, Indigenous, and other racialized and systemically marginalized peoples' radical insurgency movements that challenge white supremacy and the death world that racial capitalism and settler colonialism require. In the wake of radical insurgency movements, white being mobilizes to recuperate its losses, reconstruct itself, reestablish and reassert itself as dominant. And it does so not only through its usual repertoire of strategies, such as racial terror and carceral state tactics, which are part of ongoing domestic war to contain liberation movements, but also through an array of seemingly inclusive and progressive white liberal reform and humanist projects. What Dylan does so brilliantly through examination of various examples, such as liberal attempts to reform policing, is to show how, quote, anti-Blackness, racial colonial violence, and domestic war not only survive periods of white liberal reform, but are the very relations of dominance on which such reforms rely and through which they often articulate. So informed by the work of Fanon, Winter, and others, Dylan exposes the perniciousness of white liberalism and liberalism's deep historical and ongoing imbrication with the brutal violence against Black communities and Indigenous nations. Again, violence which is constitutive of white being and violence which is a fundamental structuring element to racial capitalism and settler colonialism. And as such, being a structuring element to these, it must somehow remain hidden, although in plain sight. So Dylan, given your definition of domestic war and the psychic dimensions to it, this reform impulse on the part of white liberal being, in conjunction with your account of police terror as counterinsurgency in an ongoing domestic war, this is so helpful in understanding what may be going on in the white minds of the Bradley Bartons of the world, as in the case analyzed by Shireen, or in the white minds of white Americans, including teens who arm themselves and feel compelled to join the counterinsurgency with the blessing of the police to claim self-defense as they unleash their violence in an attempt to stop Black liberation movements and what these movements mean for their futurity. And similarly, it helps us elsewhere in the world understand what may be going on in the white mind of a liberal prime minister who takes a beach holiday on the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in the wake of the confirmation of graves of thousands of Indigenous children who died in the genocidal institutions of Indian residential schools in Canada and who were buried on site. All while the leftist provincial government in that locale sends pro-pipeline RCMP officers to terrorize Wet'suwet'en land defenders. So I don't have a question for you related to that, but things will connect later, I think. So a second and related important idea, which Dylan has detailed for you in his talk today, is his claim that to the extent that the United Nations definition of genocide is part of a Western humanist tradition and modeled on a paradigm of genocide as experienced by white people, it renders domestic war, so specifically racial terror against Black and Indigenous peoples past into the present, it renders domestic war both unrecognizable within white settler states as a form of genocide, and more importantly, it obscures the fact that this anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racial terror and domestic war is the precondition for the forms of genocide that are recognized by the United Nations. So this in and of itself is such an important argument. And again, it was detailed by Dylan today. So in order to clarify how domestic war within white liberal settler colonial states is a unique form of genocide, preceding other forms of genocide and inseparable from white nation building projects, Dylan introduces the notion of the logic of evisceration, which he claims, and I quote, it alludes to the unbreakable connection between spiritual, psychic, affective, and physical biological experiences that include cross-generational epigenetic inheritances of world-deforming systems of dominance, displacement, and terror. Such systems exert drastic physiological consequences, depression, suicide, paranoia, cancer, and so on, even in the absence of direct physical brutality. Dylan provides 6 more elaborations of this logic, but his account of how racial colonial power operates as a gendered technology of evisceration that forcefully redefines and remakes gender and gendered sexuality is perhaps one that most resonates with what Shireen's analysis in her paper was today. So for example, Dylan claims that rape and sexual brutality are not merely tactical or preparatory elements of racializing regimes, rather they are forms of collective evisceration. And that's an idea I find really helpful to think about. Such gendered sexual violences are ends within themselves, enacting anti-Blackness and racial colonial dominance as conditions of both intimate and systemic bodily subjection. And so my first question for you, Dylan, was already articulated by Shireen in her invitation to you. And that is that I would like you, if you can, at the end of, or when the conversation begins, to say a little bit more about how the logic of evisceration and the logic of reform together may be relevant to or connect with Shireen's analysis of how colonial power operated within the Barton retrial. 3. So Dylan's account of the logic of evisceration also relates to the third and final important point that I will highlight. And this is Dylan's claim that, quote, despite racial power's inclination to obliterate, capture, and violate its targets, eruptions of liberation and self-determination persistently destabilize racial power. And so one of the things that I appreciate most about your work, Dylan, is that you show how relevant Fanon's and Winter's anti-colonial analysis remains for analyzing our historical present, and how important it is to name and analyze both the brutality of white liberalism's dehumanization projects, as well as the importance of analyzing collective agency and liberation movements as core to the racial power dynamic within settler colonial contexts. And in particular, you mentioned abolition praxis and transformative justice movements, movements that are rooted in centuries of Black lived experience, knowledge, and resistance, and which give rise to collective world making and the creation of new ways of being and new ways of living justice, even in the midst of ongoing anti-Black violence, racial terror, and domestic war. So my second question concerns white violence in this sort of circular power dynamics of domestic war, insurgency, and counterinsurgency. I do understand how powerful Indigenous resurgence movements are, for example, in refusing to seek recognition from white being, and similarly how empowering Black abolition praxis and transformative justice movements are in creating new institutions and ways of relating both now and over time. But I'm interested in what, if anything, will stop violence and domestic war as part of that cyclical power dynamic. Will white violence just eventually die out as more and more people turn our backs on white being and take up new ways of relating? Or will other strategies also be necessary? For example, self-defense in the form of armed resistance. And so my second question is, will you please expand on the thoughts you ended your paper on police terror with? And there you stated that, quote, the labor of abolitionists, Black liberation, and anti-colonialists is to turn terror on itself, to wage unrelenting creative violence against it, and to honor the deep responsibilities of care, grace, and militantly defended life. So can you just say more about how to turn terror on itself and whether this also involves armed resistance? So that's my second question. And again, my first question was just asking you to speak to the logic of evisceration and the logic of reform in relation to Shireen's analysis of Barton retrial. And so, Dylan, I want to thank you again for gifting us with your critical analysis of white reconstruction, genocide, domestic war, and police terror as counterinsurgency. You've given me and everyone so much to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for those insightful comments and provocative questions. So we'll now hear from our other commentator, Denise Ferreira Silva, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience, or what we'll allow our speakers to respond and then open it up for questions from the audience. Denise?
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you. I would like to say that I'm speaking from the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, lands where I live and work, and to whom I'm grateful for their generously hosting me. And I also would like to acknowledge that my presence here is made possible by institutions enabled by racial violence. Thanks, Shireen, for this powerful paper and for the invite to be part of today's panel. And it's very nice to meet everybody who is here, in particular Shannon and Leslie. So it's always a treat to read and listen to Shireen and Dylan. And especially, I think it's the first time I'm listening to you speaking back to back. And of course, unescapably, my comments will be generally very around about both of your papers, and I can see how I meet Dylan's paper on the fringes, which is always the best place to be. But reading Shireen's draft of Gray Zones in Law, Sexual Terror, Genocide, and the Erotic Schemes of Settler Colonialism. So as I was reading, my mind kept wandering off, trying to consider the relationship between gray zones in law and the black spaces of war. So the gray zones in law in settler colonial states that you are describing, the black spaces of the US and NATO's war on terror, right? But those black spaces as reference to sovereignty. And so basically what I have to say, which is really, unfortunately, perhaps very general, it focuses on the critique of the liberal text, I think, which is what you are highlighting. But I'm focusing there also because I think, like you, I have the same preoccupation that our demands and programs for racial, gender, sexual justice, they derive from that liberal text. So I end with not so much with questions, but comments which are questions to us for reflecting. But let me just share what I have between this introduction and my comments. So anyway, this dichotomy I mentioned, I obviously could not spend much time talking about it, but so I have it as a simple dichotomy. But I think it makes sense directly in regards to the paper. For instance, I didn't have the chance to think so much about the white in the context, the gray zones and the black spaces, but we can think about the white spaces of war, right? The proper places of exercise of the sovereign's right to kill. That is, those places where killing takes place, but they are not considered sites where international law is violated. And of course, I'm thinking here about most of Iraq and of Afghanistan in the context of the so-called war on terror of the beginning of this century. but the thing is that my comments, my reading of your paper, Shireen, was very much troubled and captured by this distraction, the black spaces of war and the gray zones of law. But perhaps I should say more explicitly, my reading of your paper was preoccupied by this distraction, because in a way it was also hijacked by a preoccupation with how to think colonial, racial, societal, patriarchal violence, not as violations of, but as inherent to, actually as a very matrix, the matter that composed the post-Enlightenment liberal political architecture. And that is where I'm speaking with Dylan, I think. Now, that preoccupation resonates with two phrases that I find significant in your paper as a fundamental fact that Justice Hamilton and Sinclair use in concluding that Helen Berry Osborne's murder was a racist and sexist act, right? That she would be alive today if she weren't an Aboriginal woman. And then the commissioners describing her killers as showing unimaginable fury. And I know you worked, the paper is so much about elaborating on these two crucial phrases. So, but I have a couple of comments around them. One, more directly on racial violence targeting the body of the former colonized, indigenous or Black. I think that racial violence recalls that moment where the law and the sovereign are indistinguishable. That moment, so and in that sense, that racial violence is colonial violence, right? In the colony, racial violence is the fundamental fact. It is the proper deployment of sovereign power. So, something that comes as a question that I think you suggest is what happens to our demands for justice, both demands made in the courts, but also in the halls of government. So demands for social justice, when we stand and stay with the violence, not as exceptional, but as inherent in the liberal architecture. As something facilitated by the calling upon on racial difference, as in the case of Cindy Gladue, the reference to malnutrition and prostitution without going beyond that, stopping there. And the other is around sexual violence. I think that is a doubling down in these murders of Betty Osborne, Pamela George, Cindy Gladue, and other hundreds of Indigenous women killed here in Canada, and also Indigenous and Mestizo women killed in Mexico. And this doubling down has to do with the fact that that proper legal subject, the white male figure presumed as the citizen, now the one that to be protected by the laws of the polity, that legal subject never relinquished his heteropatriarchal power, right? In the books of liberalism, that remained his place of exercise of his liberty. So the unimaginable fury is only unimaginable because the legal subject before that court is also a conqueror, settler, slave owner. It is the one for whom displacing the indigenous guardians of the land was never enough. The one for whom the disappearance of indigenous peoples is the condition of possibility for his existence. So it is unimaginable because it is already material. It is embedded in the institutions. So maybe another way of saying this, and then I'm just following, you are asking me to talk about the staying with violence in the analysis of sexual violence. And I think, something you show it very well, staying with the violence is to find the colonial, where total violence is the proper mode of governance, is to find the colonial excess rewritten as proper measure when the questions about the conditions under which Cindy Gladwell's murder took place are presented as social conditions without ever question of beyond the social, as if in the settler colonial context, the social were just this abstract space. And we know of the different faces, the faces of genocide, and Dylan has talked about it. So I'm almost finished. So the task, right? The task with which you finish the paper, Shireen, which the task of understanding sexualized violence, along with the erotic schemes of empire, which is a very simple way that I'm saying it now. It's much more complex, as you showed. So I have these two questions, which are questions that I'm left wondering about, and I think, I don't know if you'd like to consider them. You don't have to. I think one is, what's the appropriate image for gathering this joint operation of the sexual, the racial, the colonial violence and the liberal architecture? In particular, when one realizes that before the body of the colonized racial order, the law itself is gray, not zones, but the law itself. And then I'm thinking, for instance, how intersectionality seems so appropriate as an analysis, as an analytic of the liberal architecture, when the colonial racial and sexual violence are approached through categories, but then when we approach them as constitutive violence, what kind of image we could come up with. And the second is about unimaginable fury. So the courts and the public policies are supposed to address, what they are supposed to address is condition of possibility for these structures, that is general structures, law and sovereignty. Now the total, as I think I said that before, but I just want to finish with it. The total violence of the colony is a component, is a cement, the wiring, the bricks of this liberal architecture. It holds it together. So similar question, what becomes of the task of critique when it begins and stays with the fundamental fact that the formal, conceptual, categorical, institutional things they are about are made possible by such unimaginable fury, by colonial, when colonial racial societal patriarchal violence is seeping through, as you show in, as you describe how Cindy Gladwell's body becomes evidence, right? That the very constitution of her vagina as evidence, as objectification is female flesh ungendered, Spiller's female flesh ungendered being, again, as an act, bloodless apparently, act of colonial violence in the court. Yeah.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Denise. Okay, so I'd like to offer Shireen and Dylan an opportunity to respond before we go to open it up for questions from the audience in the chat.
I'll try to be very uncharacteristically concise in my in my reflections. First, I want to say thank you to Leslie. Just so thoughtful, and I just honestly, I really just deeply appreciate anytime somebody reads my shit and takes it to heart the way you just did. So it just always moves me every time when somebody does that. So I just want to say thank you, Leslie. So the two quick crystallized responses I have to the questions. The first one around thinking about how the logic of evisceration and then this violence of reformist counterinsurgency can be thought about together in relation to the coloniality of the Barton retrial. My quick response, my working response, and I obviously have to think about this much more because this is my first time really, listening to Shireen talk about this project. I think it might have to do, it might provide that linking the logic of evisceration and the analysis of the counterinsurgency reform it might help provide some tools to bring clarity to how that trial was so much about rationalizing terror by way of trying to discipline its modes of narrativity as a colonial act. There's like multiple thoughts kind of wrapped into one sentence. So in other words, the way in which the capacity of narrativity to work around this gendered sexual terror becomes one of the objects of domestication and pacification. That's where I was, kind of feeling the coloniality come out in the reflection that Shireen was sharing. So I think that might be part of it. That'd be the first answer, my working answer to the first question. The second one is something we can and should build collective praxis, study, and curriculum and pedagogy around. Your second question, which is thinking about both what forms of, and I'm gonna say collective work, right? What forms of collective work, labor, imagination, et cetera, would potentially be effective or have been effective, right? Thinking about the long historical archive, right? In interrupting and stopping these various circuits of violence, right? And the circuits of violence in the case in which we're living them right now, I think have to do with the simultaneity of reactionary, and I'm not just in the United States, but all over the globe, right? The simultaneity of reactionary forms of gendered nationalist violence. In most cases, it has some direct connection to white nationalist violence. And then what I've been naming as the violence of a reformist counterinsurgency that just re-legitimates the very same apparatuses, structures, discursive regimes and whatnot that form the conditions of possibility and the emboldening of that reactionary violence, as well as all the other forms of normalized state violence. So what would interrupt that? I think on the one hand, you're right to kind of identify the immediacies of self-defense, right? So we can look at the law, but this is what I want to say. I think we need to actually study the archive of those urgent, autonomous, Black self-defense and other indigenous and anti-colonial self-defense practices, because they've always been much more than just rigorous training in armed paramilitary self-defense. Now, I do think we need to study that, right? I actually believe we need to study that. Like everybody who's got the capacity to study that should study that to whatever degree they can, in whatever way they can, even if it's, and I'm not just talking about familiarity with firearms. I'm talking about familiarity with like the tactics, the protocols, the pedagogies of doing self-defense, which is really it's really a form of community making, right? And this is what I'm saying, is that in all those instances in which self-defense was mobilized as defense against, chattel plantation aggression, against captivity, against coloniality and conquest. In every case, those are actually forms of making, collective making, self-defense, that is. Self-defense becomes the form of collective. In other words, not just isolated to training people to defend a perimeter of some kind. I was thinking about this just a week ago because I started talking about how my undergraduate background, I came out of Africana Studies at Cornell University, right? And famously at Cornell, the origins of Africana Studies as, within the university, a relatively autonomous unit for a long time. It came from Black student-based militancy and radicalism, right? And the famous images of young Black male students, cisgender Black male students, taking siege of Willard Straight Hall during I want to call it white parent visitation day with rifles, right? And so there's this notion of like these, Black male aggression seizing the campus. Like what folks have oftentimes forgotten to include in that narrative is that was actually a self-defensive act, right? That the reason why Black people, Black students were arming themselves at that moment in Ithaca and Cornell's history was because they were directly dealing with threats and acts of anti-Black terrorism from white students and local white people. So that was actually a self-defensive act. Now think about what I just said about the making of, how that becomes an act of making, an act of, like that shit created Africana Studies, right? The act of self-defense, right? The act of self-defense actually becomes the thing that animates the construction of this relatively, kind of self-determining intellectual site of intellectual praxis, Black radical intellectual praxis. As far as elaborating that labor that I kind of tried to end the paper with, the notion of turning terror on itself, it's more, I want to say at this moment, I'm fixated on urging people to just embrace that that stream of praxis, which is to think about how pushing back against terror is already experienced by those who normalize it as a form of violence against them, right? And then the problem that I think I want to confront all the time is how there's a kind of hardwired liberal response a lot of folks have to just deny that they're committing violence, right? So we call it white fragility, we call it something else, like, oh, you're not really. But the fact of the matter is, if we're serious about displacing the normality of the condition of terror, for those who embody it as normality, they actually do experience it as violence. So my question is, like, how can we actually acknowledge and honor it in a creative and productive way that advances it, right? Unless people know, yeah, you're experiencing this violence, you know what, you probably should, right? The disarticulation you feel is something that you ought to feel. And then how does that potentially become a creative opportunity, right? An opportunity to further push and advance an abolitionist imagination and politics that is constructively and productively destructive, because abolition has always been about burning plantations down. It's always been about that, right? It's always been about these various forms of violence, but it's also a demystification of violence. That's what abolition also is, right? In so many ways, it's a demystification of violence. It's like an honest and transparent coming to terms with the totality of violences, and also an embrace of how it is that you can generate an aesthetic practice that certain people experience as deeply violating to them. The problem is that the way that generally happens is really oppressive, right? It's usually misogynist, or it's transphobic, or it's colonial, or it's, or it's anti-Black. My thing is, like, what if we thought about abolitionist aesthetic practices as disruptive of the normality of those violences? I'm inspired by a bunch of different people. I'm inspired by poets, by visual artists, and by all kinds of folks, and teachers, right? Teachers do this as well. So a lot of what I'm trying to get at is that, and the necessity of intervening on the violence of the liberal narratives that want to constantly disavow abolition as a present tense, immediate, pragmatic way of being, right? Folks want to postpone it as if it's only available some other time elsewhere down the line. And they want to disavow how abolition is a form of analysis, it's a form of community making, it's a form of aesthetic production, it's a form of pedagogical commitment, it's a form of imagination, it's a form of making. Anyway, that's a partial working answer to that question. I'm gonna shut up now. I want to hear everyone else.
Thanks, Dylan. Shireen?
I'm gonna just, Denise always does this for me, which is why I desperately wanted her to be here, which is to take the points that I want to think about and reframe them in a way that is so generative. So thank you, Denise, for always doing that. It would have gone much better if you and I could have been in a bar somewhere just having this discussion. But the first point you raised about the gray zones in law and the relationship between those gray zones and the black zones in war, I think that's completely right on. My short answer to that would be the one always requires the other, which is what actually your work has taught me to see for a long time. And if the one requires the other, then our demands cannot derive from the liberal text. I mean, that, you open your global idea of race with that whole idea of inclusion cannot be where it's at for that very reason. So I think that that's a really good kind of metaphor to think of the coloring of the zones as they go along, and what is the white zone in law. Related to that, something you said a bit later, that law itself is gray. Well, the idea that law has kind of this built-in, a kind of built-in grayness that will take Blackness every time it enters the courtroom, or indigeneity will take it and put it in a place where it operates like a gray zone, where all is authorized against that body. I think that it's really important to keep that in mind as we consider what kind of strategies we might use. And my overall worry that's really underpinning this paper is that feminists have given courts a language for some things. We've given courts the language of intersectionality. which is interesting. We've given courts the language of sex work, but not given courts the language of terror, colonial terror, not found a way to deal with, as you put it, that fundamental fact. So I really like that you insist on, why Barton's and white men's fury is unimaginable is because it's already material. I think that's completely brilliant, and that's the insight that I would want to sort of run with. As for how that colonial context enters the courtroom, well, it's definitely there, as Dylan said, that, terror is rationalized, and that's how you know the colonial is at work. Can you bring it in any other way? There were details about Gladio's life, eating out of garbage cans and things like this, that could only be contextualized in colonial history. The problem is that every time that enters the courtroom, it enters exactly the way her vagina does, which it just marks her, but doesn't include the colonial context itself. It doesn't ever mark white people. So that is the trouble that we have when we have to fight things in law. And then the last thing I would say, I'm taken with and want to think of your last point about what becomes of critique in this context. That is the underlying unease that I really need to work out and need to think about, and we all do, of course, need to think about that, what becomes of critique itself. And that is really what is driving this paper. And there is a kind of dissonance that keeps happening in the feminist classroom, where the things that I want to name as terror and as colonial violence, as racial violence, those things are somehow getting translated as me not being liberal enough. And I'm just so worried about that, because I don't know what is it. It's almost like, is there a tone that I could strike? What is the analysis that I could offer here? Because I find myself completely unable to deal with it. As students listening might remember, I just get launched off into this path that is no good pedagogically. So I'll leave that open. We haven't got that much time for questions, but thank you very much, Denise, for those provocative questions.